There is a question that most of us never consciously ask ourselves, yet it quietly shapes every decision we make, every relationship we form, and every ambition we pursue or abandon. The question is this: what is the deepest drive within you? What, beneath all your desires, are you really reaching for? Sigmund Freud said it was the pleasure principle, the drive to seek pleasure and avoid pain. Later, he added a darker counterpart to it, namely the death drive. Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher who haunted Nietzsche's early life, said the engine of existence was a blind, insatiable will to live, a cosmic striving that brought mostly suffering. Nietzsche looked at both of these answers and said, "No, you are both wrong," and in their place, he offered one of the most daring, most misunderstood, and most psychologically rich ideas in the history of philosophy. He called it the will to power, not the will to dominate, not the will to conquer, not the will to accumulate wealth or control others. Those are symptoms, pale, distorted shadows of something far deeper. In this video, we are going to descend into what Nietzsche really meant by the will to power, its psychological architecture, its implications for how we live, how we suffer, how we create, and why understanding it might change how you see yourself and everything around you. Let us begin by clearing away the most damaging misconception. For much of the 20th century, the will to power was associated with the worst of human impulses: domination, conquest, and the crushing of the weak. This was largely the fault of Nietzsche's sister, Elisabeth Nietzsche, who after her brother's mental collapse edited his unpublished notes selectively and handed them to the Nazi regime as philosophical ammunition. The Nazis loved the phrase. They stripped it of all its complexity and used it to justify brutality. Nietzsche himself would have been appalled. He despised German nationalism. He despised anti-Semitism. He once wrote that his ideal reader was someone who had nothing but contempt for politics. He explicitly mocked those who equated power with the domination of others, calling it the lowest, most impoverished expression of what power could mean. So what did he mean? The will to power in Nietzsche's philosophy is not primarily about power over others. It is about power over oneself. It is the fundamental drive not merely to survive, not merely to be comfortable, but to grow, to overcome, to become more than you currently are. He wrote, "My idea is that every specific body strives to become master over all space and to extend its force, and to thrust back all that resists its extension. But it continually encounters similar efforts on the part of other bodies and ends by coming to an arrangement, a union, with those of them that are sufficiently related to it. Thus they then conspire together for power." This is not a political manifesto. It's a description of the fundamental nature of life itself. Every living thing in Nietzsche's vision is not simply trying to maintain itself. It is trying to expand, to master its environment, to surpass its previous limits. Life at its core is not self-preservation. Life is self-overcoming. Now, let us go deeper into what this means psychologically, because this is where Nietzsche's insight becomes genuinely transformative. Think of a moment in your life when you felt most alive. Not merely comfortable, but alive. Chances are that it was not a moment of pure ease. It was probably a moment of challenge met, a difficulty overcome, a fear confronted, a skill mastered after long struggle. The mountain climbed, the piece of music finally played as you had heard it in your mind, the honest conversation you had been avoiding for months that you finally summoned the courage to have. Nietzsche observed that the human being does not flourish in the absence of resistance. We flourish through it. The will to power is not the desire to eliminate obstacles, it is the desire to encounter worthy ones. This is why wealth, comfort, and security, the things that most people spend their lives pursuing, so often produce not happiness, but a strange, nagging emptiness when finally achieved. The goal was never rest. The goal was the striving itself. Nietzsche wrote one of his most quoted lines on this. "What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not an end." You are not a destination. You are a process. And when the process of self-overcoming stops, when you settle, when you become comfortable, when you no longer have anything genuine to strive toward, something essential begins to die in you. This is why Nietzsche was so contemptuous of what he called the morality of comfort. This is the cultural tendency to treat the elimination of suffering and the maximization of ease as the highest human goal. For him, this was not liberation. It was a slow spiritual suffocation. A life organized entirely around avoiding difficulty is a life that has, in a profound sense, already given up. Various psychologists have spent decades studying on what they called flow, the state of optimal human experience, and what they found mapped almost perfectly onto Nietzsche's intuition. Human beings experience their greatest well being not in leisure, but in the state of full engagement with a challenge that is just at the edge of their current ability. Not too easy, because that produces boredom, not too hard, because that produces anxiety, but right at the growing edge. This is where we come alive. Nietzsche would have recognized this immediately. The will to power at its healthiest is precisely this, the drive to locate the growing edge and to push against it. But Nietzsche was too honest a thinker to offer only the positive vision. He also diagnosed the dark, twisted forms that the will of power takes when it's blocked, suppressed, or misdirected. He introduced a concept that is central to his entire philosophy, ressentiment. Nietzsche chose it deliberately because the concept had a specific weight in his framework. Ressentiment is not simply resentment, though it includes that. It is the psychological state of a person whose will of power has been frustrated, who cannot express their drive toward greatness, mastery, or self overcoming through direct creative action, and who therefore turns that energy inward and backward into a festering, reactive hatred of those who have what they cannot obtain. This is a devastating psychological portrait, and it's all around us. The person consumed by ressentiment does not say, I will become stronger, more capable, more excellent. Instead, they say, those who are strong, capable, and excellent must be brought down. Their values are corrupt. Their goodness is really just a mask for evil. For Nietzsche, this was not merely a character flaw in certain individuals. He believed it was the defining psychological dynamic of entire moral systems. His analysis of what he called slave morality, or the moral framework that elevates weakness, victimhood, and suffering as spiritual virtues while demonizing strength, excellence, and self assertion, was, at its root, a psychology of ressentiment writ large. The weak, unable to overcome through genuine power, overcome by redefining the terms of the game. They declare that meekness is holy, that suffering is noble, that the powerful are evil, and in doing so, they achieve a kind of psychological victory without ever having to change themselves. Now, this is Nietzsche at his most controversial, and it is important not to oversimplify him here. He was not saying that the powerful are always right or that the suffering are always wrong. He makes a psychological observation about how blocked power corrupts the soul, about the differences between a person who genuinely loves what they are building and a person who has organized their entire identity around hating what others have built. And when we look around at the bitterness that has infected public discourse, or at the culture of grievance and victimhood that has become, in many spaces, a form of social currency, we can see Nietzsche's diagnosis with uncomfortable clarity. Closely related to the will to power is Nietzsche's famous and widely misread distinction between master morality and slave morality. Let us look at this carefully because it is not what most people think. Master morality in Nietzsche's framework is not the morality of the politically powerful or the wealthy. It's a psychological orientation. The person of master morality begins with themselves. They ask, what do I genuinely value? What in my experience is good, noble, and excellent? What expresses the fullness of what I can be? Their ethics are affirmative, rooted in the love of something rather than the hatred of something. Slave morality, by contrast, begins with the other. It begins with the enemy. It defines the good negatively, not as what I love, but as the opposite of what I hate. It needs an external villain to give itself shape. Without the oppressor, it loses its reason to exist. Without the evil it can point to, it cannot identify what it values. Nietzsche was not endorsing cruelty or calling for the exploitation of the weak. He was naming a psychological difference between two orientations towards life. one that is generative and affirmative, rooted in genuine love and creation, and the other one that is reactive and resentful, rooted in opposition and negation. The healthy will to power is always oriented towards creation. The sick will to power is always oriented toward destruction of others, mostly as a substitute for the growth that the person is unable or unwilling to undertake themselves. And here is the genuinely uncomfortable insight. In any given moment, in any given relationship, or conversation, or cultural battle, we are capable of both. The question Nietzsche leaves us with is, which mode are you actually operating in right now? Are you building something you love, or are you destroying something you hate, and call that your purpose? At its highest expression, the expression Nietzsche cared about most deeply, the will to power is the drive to create. Nietzsche himself was many things: a philosopher, a poet, a musician, a psychologist, and he believed that the deepest human impulse was not to dominate but to give form to chaos, to impose meaning on raw experience, to create something that had not existed before. Art, philosophy, science, great relationships, a life lived with integrity, all of these are expressions of the will to power at its most sublime. He wrote, "The secret for harvesting from existence the greatest fruitfulness and the greatest enjoyment is to live dangerously." What he meant by dangerously was not recklessly. He meant to be willing to stake something real, to take on a project worthy of your full capacity, to refuse the safe, the comfortable, the mediocre, and to risk failure in the pursuit of genuine excellence. Think of every person whose work has moved you, every artist, writer, scientist, or teacher who changed something in you. What they shared was not safety, it was commitment, a willingness to pour themselves fully into something, to be transformed by it, to let it cost them something real. That is the will to power expressed through creation. And Nietzsche believed this was not a rare gift available only to geniuses. It was the birthright of every human being. The capacity to encounter your life as raw material and to sculpt it into something genuinely your own. The tragedy in his view was how rarely people claimed this birthright, how readily they traded the deep satisfaction of self-creation for the shallow comfort of conformity. He described the unexamined, drifting life as the life of the herd. These are the people who adopt their values wholesale from their culture, their family, their social group, without ever genuinely asking whether those values are truly theirs. The herd does not create, it imitates, it conforms. It is moved by social pressure rather than by genuine inner conviction. And in doing so, it squanders the most distinctly human capacity, the capacity to alter one's own existence. So what does all of this mean in practice? How does the will to power, properly understood, change how we approach our lives? The first implication is a radical reorientation of what we seek. If Nietzsche is right, then the goal is not to maximize comfort, not to eliminate difficulty, not to achieve a final stable state of security and satisfaction. The goal is to be in a genuine, meaningful struggle with something worthy, to be in the process of becoming more than you currently are. This means that the discomfort you feel when you are genuinely growing is not a problem to be solved. It is a sign that you are alive. The second implication concerns how we relate to others. If we are honest with ourselves, we will notice that much of what passes for moral concern, much of our outrage, our criticism, our campaigns against the failures of others, is rooted not in genuine love of what we are building, but in ressentiment, in the bitter awareness of something we want and do not have, the will to bring others down, dressed in language of justice. Nietzsche's psychology asks us to be ruthlessly honest about which one is operating in us in any given moment. Is this coming from my strength or from my wound? The third implication is perhaps the most demanding. The will to power at its highest expression requires solitude, not the solitude of isolation, but the solitude of self-encounter. This is the willingness to withdraw from the noise of social validation and ask in genuine silence, what do I actually value? What is mine? Not what I have been told to value, not what earns me approval, not what my tribe demands of me, but what, in the deepest and most honest part of me, I know to be worth living for. This is the work Nietzsche called the philosopher's task. but he believed it was everyone's task. The philosopher in his vision was not a specialist. The philosopher was anyone willing to take the examined life seriously, to hold their values up to honest scrutiny, to shed what is borrowed and counterfeit, and to discover or forge what is genuinely their own. We began with a question: what is the deepest drive within you? Nietzsche's answer was not comfortable, but it was a honest one. Beneath the desire for pleasure, beneath the fear of pain, beneath the need for approval and the longing for safety, there is something that wants to grow. Something that wants to encounter resistance and come through it more fully itself. Something that, when it is denied long enough, turns sour and becomes resentment, becomes bitterness, becomes the need to tear down what it cannot build. The will to power at its deepest is the call of your own becoming. It is the voice that says, you have not yet become what you are capable of becoming. It is the restlessness that no amount of comfort can permanently silence. It is the reason why, at the end of a life of safety and conformity, something in a person knows, quietly and terribly, that they held back. Nietzsche did not want us to hold back. He wanted us to become who we are, fully, dangerously, creatively, and honestly. Not for the sake of domination, not at the expense of others, but for the sake of the one life we have been given, which asks of us, if we are paying attention, nothing less than everything. That is the will to power.